The avoidant lives in a world of impossible fantasies, imagining the perfect relationship that provides all the benefits of connection without any of the messy complications of genuine intimacy. They dream of a partner who understands them completely, without requiring understanding in return, who loves them unconditionally, without expecting reciprocal affection, who remains perpetually interesting, without ever becoming emotionally demanding. This fantasy partner exists only in their imagination, which is precisely why it holds such power over their hearts and minds. Most people make the fatal error of trying to win the avoidant through genuine emotional availability, honest communication, and authentic vulnerability. They believe that showing their real selves will eventually break through the avoidant's defenses and create lasting connection. But the avoidant doesn't want reality. They want the fantasy. They don't desire authentic human connection with all its imperfections and demands. They crave the impossible dream of love without cost, intimacy without vulnerability, possession without responsibility. When you become the living manifestation of their impossible dreams, when you provide the illusion of their perfect relationship while maintaining your own emotional integrity, you transform from another disappointing reality into their most cherished obsession. The mirage of the perfect partner. The avoidance fantasy partner exists in the realm of impossibility, a perfectly calibrated mirage that shimmers on the horizon of their emotional landscape, but dissolves upon closer inspection. This idealized figure possesses supernatural qualities that no real human could maintain. They are endlessly fascinating, yet never overwhelming, deeply caring, yet never needy, completely available, yet never clingy, emotionally sophisticated, yet never complicated. The avoidant has created this impossible standard as protection against the vulnerability that genuine human connection demands. Their perfect partner fantasy operates as emotional insurance against disappointment. By imagining someone who meets all their needs while requiring nothing in return, they justify their withdrawal from real relationships that inevitably fail to match this impossible ideal. Every actual person they encounter becomes measured against this fictional standard and found wanting, not because they lack quality, but because they possess the fundamental flaw of being human rather than mythological. The mirage includes specific emotional choreography that must be performed with precision. Their fantasy partner knows exactly when to approach and when to retreat, when to offer comfort and when to provide space, when to be passionate and when to be cool. This imaginary person never miscalculates emotional timing, never pushes when pulling is required, never retreats when advance would be welcomed. They possess psychic abilities that eliminate the need for actual communication about needs, boundaries, and preferences. Most crucially, the avoidant's perfect partner exists in a state of perpetual potential rather than achieved reality. They are always about to reveal deeper layers of fascination, always on the verge of providing complete understanding, always approaching, but never quite reaching the point of total emotional transparency. This eternal approach without a rival keeps the avoidant engaged without triggering their fear of being trapped or suffocated by too much intimacy too quickly. The fantasy partner provides love without labor, connection without consequence, and intimacy without the messy work of mutual emotional regulation. They never have bad days that require support, never experience insecurities that need reassurance, never make mistakes that require forgiveness. This impossible person loves the avoidant's independence rather than challenging it, celebrates their emotional distance rather than trying to bridge it, and finds their commitment issues charming rather than problematic. The mirage becomes most seductive in its promise of effortless relationship maintenance. The fantasy partner never requires difficult conversations about unmet needs, never demands explanations for emotional withdrawal, never creates conflict that must be resolved through compromise and mutual understanding. They exist in perfect harmony with the avoidant's preferred rhythm of connection and disconnection, never disrupting the delicate balance with inconvenient human needs. Understanding this mirage reveals why the avoidant finds real relationships so disappointing and why they become so quickly bored with partners who reveal their authentic selves. Reality cannot compete with fantasy because fantasy is specifically designed to eliminate everything that makes relationships difficult, challenging, and growth-producing. The avoidant doesn't want to love a real person. They want to possess their own projection of perfect love made manifest. When you understand the specific contours of their mirage, you can learn to embody its most compelling elements while maintaining your own emotional integrity. The key lies not in becoming their fantasy completely, an impossible and self-destructive goal, but in understanding which aspects of their ideal you can authentically provide while protecting your own psychological well-being. Becoming the fantasy they cannot possess. The ultimate expression of the avoidance fantasy is not the partner they can easily obtain, but the one who remains perpetually just beyond their complete possession. This fantasy figure embodies the principle of eternal approach without final capture, maintaining enough distance to preserve mystery while providing enough connection to sustain hope. When you learn to position yourself as the fantasy they can touch, but never fully grasp, you become infinitely more valuable than any partner they could completely control or predict. Becoming this impossible possession requires mastering the art of simultaneous availability and unavailability. You must be present enough to maintain their interest while remaining absent enough to preserve their fascination. This delicate balance transforms you from someone they can take for granted into someone they must continuously work to understand, appreciate, and maintain. The avoidant respects what they cannot easily acquire more than what is freely given. The fantasy of the unpossessible partner operates on the principle that true value lies in rarity and difficulty of acquisition. When you make yourself completely available, completely known, and completely possessed, you eliminate the very qualities that make the avoidance fantasy compelling. But when you maintain elements of mystery, independence, and inaccessibility, you preserve the tension that keeps their imagination engaged and their desire activated. Your unpossessibility must feel natural rather than calculated, authentic rather than manipulative. The avoidant's sophisticated psychological radar can detect artificial scarcity and strategic withdrawal, designed solely to increase their interest. But when your occasional unavailability stems from genuine commitments to your own life, goals, and interests, it carries the weight of authenticity that makes it irresistibly attractive rather than obviously strategic. The fantasy deepens when they realize that your elusiveness is not a game played for their benefit, but a natural consequence of your own fullness of life. You become unpossessible, not because you're trying to avoid them, but because you are actively pursuing something more compelling than their attention. This realization transforms their perception of you from someone playing hard to get into someone genuinely difficult to get. Maintaining this position requires genuine investment in your own growth, interests, and independence. You cannot fake the kind of personal magnetism that makes someone truly unpossessible. When your life becomes genuinely interesting, when your goals become genuinely compelling, when your independence becomes genuinely fulfilling, the avoidant senses this authenticity and finds themselves drawn to what they cannot easily access or control. The unpossessible fantasy partner exists in a state of perpetual motion, always growing, changing, and evolving in ways that prevent complete understanding or prediction. You become someone they can know partially, but never completely, love deeply, but never possess entirely, understand somewhat, but never predict perfectly. This partial accessibility maintains their engagement while protecting your autonomy. Most powerfully, when you embody the fantasy of the unpossessible partner, you force the avoidant to operate from a position of pursuit rather than their preferred position of being pursued. They must work to maintain your interest, effort to secure your attention, and strategy to keep your focus. This role reversal awakens dormant aspects of their personality that have been suppressed by years of being the pursued rather than the pursuer, often revealing capacities for effort and investment they had forgotten they possessed. The illusion of emotional safety. The avoidant's deepest fantasy revolves around finding someone who provides complete emotional safety, a partner who will never hurt them, never disappoint them, never require more than they can comfortably give, and never trigger the vulnerability that terrifies them most. This fantasy partner serves as an emotional anesthetic, providing all the warmth of human connection without any of the risks that make genuine intimacy feel dangerous to their carefully protected hearts. Creating this illusion requires understanding that the avoidant's definition of emotional safety differs radically from most people's understanding of the concept. While others seek safety through communication, reassurance, and mutual vulnerability, the avoidant finds safety only in emotional distance, predictable patterns, and the absence of demands for deeper connection. Your task becomes providing comfort without challenge, presence without pressure, and love without the labor that typically accompanies genuine intimacy. The illusion of safety begins with your ability to remain emotionally regulated regardless of their behavior, when you neither pursue them during their withdrawal nor punish them for their distance. When you maintain your own emotional equilibrium independent of their choices, you become a source of stability in their otherwise chaotic emotional landscape. They begin to trust that you will not create drama, demand explanations, or force confrontations about their emotional unavailability. Your emotional consistency becomes the foundation of their safety fantasy. The avoidant has learned to associate emotional intensity with eventual pain, dramatic expressions of love with future demands for reciprocity, and passionate connection with inevitable disappointment. When you provide steady, reliable emotional presence without the peaks and valleys that characterize most relationships, you begin to represent something they have never experienced: love without chaos. The safety illusion deepens when you demonstrate that your emotional well-being does not depend on their behavior or attention. Most partners of avoidance create the very insecurity they claim to want to heal by making their happiness contingent on the avoidant's emotional availability. But when you maintain your own emotional stability, regardless of their choices, you prove that loving them will not destroy you, and therefore that they can accept your love without carrying the burden of your emotional survival. Understanding their safety fantasy means recognizing that the avoidant equates emotional demands with emotional danger. Every request for more time, attention, or commitment triggers their fear of being consumed by someone else's needs. When you learn to meet your own emotional needs through sources other than their validation, when you find fulfillment through channels that don't require their participation, you become safe in ways that no needful partner ever could. The illusion becomes most powerful when you prove that you will not use their vulnerabilities against them during conflict or disappointment. The avoidant has learned to protect themselves by revealing as little as possible about their inner world. Having experienced the pain of having their own emotional revelations weaponized by partners who felt neglected or hurt, when you demonstrate that their occasional moments of openness will be treasured rather than exploited, they begin to relax their vigilant self-protection. Your role becomes that of an emotional sanctuary, where they can rest without being required to perform, grow, or change. This doesn't mean accepting poor treatment or abandoning your own needs, but rather creating a space where their nervous system can relax, because you represent consistency, predictability, and the absence of emotional chaos that has characterized their previous relationships, playing the role of the unavailable. The avoidant's most intoxicating fantasy involves pursuing someone who mirrors their own emotional unavailability, creating a dynamic where they experience the chase rather than being chased, where they must work for attention rather than constantly deflecting it, where they find themselves in the unfamiliar position of wanting more from someone who offers carefully measured less. This role reversal awakens dormant aspects of their personality and triggers pursuit behaviors they normally reserve for others to perform. Embodying unavailability requires subtle mastery of emotional and physical distance that feels natural rather than strategic. You cannot simply copy their withdrawal patterns or mirror their communication style, as this will feel artificial and manipulative to their sophisticated psychological radar. Instead, your unavailability must stem from genuine engagement with your own life, goals, and interests that naturally create the scarcity that makes you valuable in their eyes. Your unavailability becomes most effective when it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical unavailability, through your own full schedule and commitments, signals that your time has value and must be earned. Emotional unavailability, through your own self-sufficiency, demonstrates that your happiness does not depend on their attention or validation. Mental unavailability, through your engagement with challenging pursuits, shows that your intellectual energy is invested in growth rather than relationship analysis. The key to successful unavailability lies in its authenticity. When your busy schedule stems from genuine passion for your work, hobbies, or personal development, the avoidant senses this reality and finds themselves genuinely intrigued by what captures your attention so completely. They begin to wonder what could be more interesting than focusing on them, what pursuits could be more compelling than their attention, what goals could be more important than relationship maintenance. Playing unavailable means learning to be fully present when you are together, while maintaining clear boundaries about when you are not available. This creates intensity during your interactions that compensates for their rarity, making each encounter feel significant rather than routine. The avoidant begins to treasure the time they have with you because they cannot take it for granted or assume it will always be available. Your unavailability must extend to emotional labor, as well as time and attention. When you stop being the person who initiates difficult conversations, who pursues resolution during conflict, who works to bridge emotional distance, you force the avoidant to step into these roles if they want to maintain connection. This role reversal often reveals capacities for effort and investment they had forgotten they possessed. The most sophisticated form of unavailability involves being emotionally unreachable, even when physically present. This means maintaining your own emotional center, regardless of their moods, energy, or behavior. When you cannot be easily affected by their withdrawal or swayed by their attention, you become someone they must work to impact rather than someone who automatically reacts to their emotional choices. Your unavailability becomes irresistible when it demonstrates that you have better options than accepting poor treatment or inconsistent attention. This doesn't require mentioning other romantic possibilities, but rather embodying the confidence of someone who knows their worth and has no intention of settling for less than genuine reciprocity and respect. The avoidant recognizes this confidence and finds themselves working harder to prove worthy of your limited availability. The fantasy of pursuing the unavailable awakens the avoidant's dormant capacity for effort and investment. When they must work to secure your attention, plan to spend time with you, and strategize to maintain your interest, they discover parts of themselves that have been suppressed by years of being the pursued party. This role reversal often becomes addictive for them because it allows them to experience the excitement of the chase without the suffocation of being chased, the fantasy of control without consequence. The avoidant's most seductive fantasy involves maintaining complete control over the relationship's emotional temperature, pace, and direction, while bearing none of the consequences that typically accompany such power. They dream of a partner who accepts their unilateral decisions about intimacy levels, communication frequency, and commitment depth without creating guilt, conflict, or emotional scenes. This fantasy partner serves as a willing participant in their emotional dictatorship, providing unconditional acceptance of whatever terms the avoidant chooses to offer. Creating this illusion requires understanding that the avoidant equates relationship control with emotional survival. Their need to dictate terms stems not from cruelty, but from terror. the fear that surrendering control means surrendering their autonomy, their safety, and ultimately their sense of self. When you learn to operate within their preferred framework while maintaining your own dignity, you provide them with the fantasy of consequence-free authority that they find irresistibly attractive. Your role becomes that of the ideal collaborator in their control fantasy, someone who gracefully accepts their rhythm of connection and disconnection without creating drama about the inconsistency. When they withdraw, you neither pursue nor punish. When they return, you neither interrogate nor celebrate excessively. This emotional equanimity signals that you understand the game they need to play and are sophisticated enough to play it without creating the chaos that typically accompanies their control patterns. The fantasy deepens when you demonstrate that their control doesn't diminish your own power or self-respect. Most partners of avoidance either fight for control, creating the conflict the avoidant fears, or surrender completely, becoming the doormat the avoidant eventually despises. But when you allow them control over the relationship's external structure while maintaining complete control over your own emotional state and life choices, you create the rare dynamic where their authority doesn't threaten your autonomy. Understanding their control fantasy means recognizing that the avoidant doesn't actually want to control you. They want to control their own level of vulnerability and exposure within the relationship. When you make it clear that your emotional well-being, life satisfaction, and sense of self-worth operate independently of their relationship choices, you eliminate their fear that their control will destroy you, making it safe for them to exercise the authority they need to feel secure. The consequence-free aspect of their fantasy requires that you never use their control patterns against them during moments of conflict or disappointment. When you resist the temptation to point out their emotional inconsistency, criticize their communication patterns, or demand explanations for their withdrawal, you prove that their control doesn't create the relationship problems they've learned to expect and fear. Your sophisticated acceptance of their control needs becomes a form of gift rather than submission. You're not tolerating their authority because you lack options or self-respect, but because you understand their psychological requirements and choose to accommodate them as an act of conscious strategy rather than unconscious codependency. This distinction is crucial because the avoidant respects conscious choice while losing respect for unconscious submission. The fantasy becomes most intoxicating when your acceptance of their control actually enhances your attractiveness rather than diminishing it. When you demonstrate that you can gracefully operate within their framework while maintaining your own magnetism, dependence, and mysterious depth, you prove that accommodating their needs doesn't require sacrificing your own power. This realization allows them to exercise control without the guilt that typically accompanies their relationship dominance. Most powerfully, when you embody their control fantasy perfectly, you often discover that their need for absolute authority begins to diminish, having found someone who doesn't threaten their autonomy, who doesn't use their moments of closeness against them, who doesn't create consequences for their emotional distance. They often begin to voluntarily offer more consistency, presence, and emotional availability than they ever provided when these qualities were demanded of them. Embodying their idealized independence. The avoidant's ultimate romantic fantasy involves finding someone whose independence matches or exceeds their own, creating a relationship between two self-sufficient individuals who choose each other rather than need each other. This idealized partner possesses such complete emotional autonomy that they could disappear tomorrow without creating devastation, such engaging personal pursuits that the relationship enhances rather than defines their life satisfaction, and such confident self-possession that they never require validation, reassurance, or emotional support that feels burdensome to provide. Embodying this idealized independence begins with genuine rather than performed self-sufficiency. The avoidant's sophisticated psychological radar can distinguish between authentic autonomy and strategic independence, designed to attract their attention. When your independence stems from real investment in your own growth, goals, and interests, rather than calculated distance. It carries the authenticity that makes it irresistibly attractive to someone who values genuine self-possession above all other qualities. Your independence becomes idealized when it operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Financial independence signals that you're not seeking security through relationship. Emotional independence demonstrates that your happiness doesn't depend on their behavior or attention. Social independence shows that your life satisfaction comes from diverse sources rather than romantic connection alone. Intellectual independence proves that your mental stimulation derives from your own pursuits rather than their conversation or validation. The fantasy deepens when your independence enhances rather than threatens their own autonomy. Most people's independence feels competitive to the avoidant, as if there isn't room for two self-sufficient people in the same relationship. But when your autonomy complements rather than competes with theirs, when your independence gives them permission to be equally self-focused, you create the rare dynamic where two people can be together without either sacrificing their individual identity or growth trajectory. Understanding their independence fantasy means recognizing that the avoidant doesn't want to be needed in traditional ways. They don't want to be someone's emotional security system, financial safety net, or primary source of life satisfaction. When you demonstrate that you want them rather than need them, that you choose their company rather than require it, that you enjoy their presence rather than depend on it, you offer them the freedom that makes love feel safe rather than suffocating. Your idealized independence must extend to your emotional responses to their behavior. When you remain equally content, whether they're present or absent, equally fulfilled, whether they're attentive or distant, equally satisfied, whether they're communicative or withdrawn, you prove that your well-being operates independently of their choices. This emotional autonomy becomes incredibly attractive to someone who fears being responsible for another person's happiness. The independence fantasy becomes most compelling when it's demonstrated through action rather than declaration. Instead of talking about your self-sufficiency, you simply live it. Instead of explaining your autonomy, you embody it. Instead of defending your independence, you exercise it naturally and consistently. This demonstration carries far more weight than any verbal assurance about your emotional self-reliance. Most powerfully, when you embody their idealized independence completely, you often trigger their deepest fear and greatest desire simultaneously, the fear of not being needed and the desire to be genuinely chosen. This psychological tension creates the emotional intensity that the avoidant finds both terrifying and irresistible, awakening feelings they thought they had successfully suppressed while providing the freedom they believed was incompatible with genuine love. Your independence becomes idealized when it includes the ability to walk away from the relationship without devastation if it fails to meet your standards for mutual respect, genuine reciprocity, and emotional fulfillment. This ultimate independence, the freedom to leave, often becomes the very quality that makes the avoidant most determined to give you reasons to stay. The ultimate fantasy, someone who doesn't need them. The avoidant's most paradoxical and powerful fantasy centers on finding someone who genuinely doesn't need them, whose life operates at full capacity without their presence, whose happiness remains unaffected by their attention or absence, and whose sense of completeness exists, independent of romantic connection. This fantasy partner represents the ultimate psychological puzzle, someone the avoidant cannot manipulate through withdrawal, cannot control through withholding, and cannot predict through their usual patterns of emotional distance and intermittent reinforcement. This fantasy operates on the principle that we most desire what we cannot easily obtain or influence. When you genuinely don't need the avoidance validation, attention, or presence to maintain your emotional equilibrium, you become infinitely more valuable than someone whose well-being rises and falls with their behavior. Your lack of need transforms you from a burden to be managed into a prize to be won, from someone seeking completion through them into someone offering enhancement to their life. The power of not needing them lies in how it reverses the traditional dynamic that governs avoidant relationships. Instead of you working to secure their attention, they find themselves working to capture yours. Instead of you adjusting your behavior to accommodate their moods, they discover themselves considering your preferences. Instead of you waiting for their communication, they notice themselves reaching out first. This role reversal awakens dormant aspects of their personality that have been suppressed by years of being pursued rather than pursuing. Your genuine lack of need must be demonstrated through consistent behavior rather than proclaimed through words. When you maintain your own social life, pursue your own goals, find satisfaction through your own achievements, and experience joy through sources that don't include them, the avoidant recognizes the authenticity of your independence. They sense that your contentment without them is real rather than performed, which makes your choice to include them in your life feel like a gift rather than a given. Understanding this ultimate fantasy means recognizing that the avoidant has spent their entire romantic life feeling suffocated by others' emotional needs, guilty about their inability to provide traditional relationship comfort, and trapped by partners who made their happiness contingent on avoidant behavior change. When you demonstrate that your happiness operates independently of their choices, you eliminate the pressure that has made love feel dangerous and burdensome throughout their adult life. The fantasy deepens when they realize that your lack of need for them doesn't translate into lack of appreciation for what they do offer. You can enjoy their company without requiring it, value their unique qualities without depending on them for validation, and find pleasure in their presence without being devastated by their absence. This sophisticated emotional position represents everything they've dreamed of, but never experienced in romantic connection. Most significantly, when you embody the fantasy of someone who doesn't need them, you often discover that their need for you begins to emerge. Having found someone who won't be destroyed by their emotional limitations, who won't suffocate them with demands for more than they can comfortably give, who won't use their vulnerabilities against them during conflict, they often begin to experience the safety necessary for their own emotional needs to surface. The ultimate irony of this fantasy is that by genuinely not needing them, you create the conditions where they feel safe enough to need you. Your emotional independence gives them permission to depend on you in small ways because they trust that your stability won't crumble under the weight of their occasional vulnerability. They begin to lean on someone who won't fall down, trust someone who won't exploit their trust, and open up to someone who won't use their openness as ammunition for future emotional warfare. Maintaining the fantasy without losing yourself. The greatest challenge in embodying the avoidance fantasy lies in maintaining your authentic self while providing the illusion of their ideal partner, walking the razor's edge between strategic accommodation and complete self-abandonment. This delicate balance requires sophisticated self-awareness, clear personal boundaries, and the ability to give selectively without depleting your own emotional resources or compromising your fundamental values and needs. Maintaining the fantasy authentically begins with understanding which aspects of their ideal you can genuinely embody without violence to your own nature, and which elements would require you to betray essential parts of yourself. If you're naturally independent and self-sufficient, embodying their independence fantasy feels authentic. If you're naturally warm but not clingy, providing emotional safety comes naturally. But if accommodating their fantasy requires suppressing fundamental aspects of your personality, the strategy becomes self-destructive rather than self-serving. The key lies in enhancement rather than transformation. Instead of becoming someone completely different to match their fantasy, you amplify the aspects of your authentic self that align with their ideal while managing the parts that might trigger their avoidance patterns. This approach maintains your psychological integrity while providing enough of their fantasy to capture and hold their attention without losing yourself in the process. Successful fantasy maintenance requires setting internal boundaries that protect your core needs while accommodating their relationship style. You might accept their need for emotional distance while maintaining your own requirement for basic respect. You might work within their communication patterns while refusing to accept treatment that damages your self-esteem. You might honor their autonomy while protecting your own right to reciprocity and consideration. Understanding the difference between strategic flexibility and self-betrayal becomes crucial for long-term psychological health. Strategic flexibility involves adapting your approach to work more effectively with their personality style while maintaining your essential self. Self-betrayal involves abandoning your own needs, values, or identity to become what you think they want. The former enhances your natural magnetism. The latter destroys the very qualities that made you attractive initially. Maintaining the fantasy without self-loss requires regular honest self-assessment about whether the relationship enhances or diminishes your life satisfaction. If embodying their fantasy allows you to express the best versions of your natural qualities while receiving genuine appreciation and reciprocity, the strategy serves both parties. If maintaining their fantasy requires constant self-suppression and accepts poor treatment, the approach becomes self-destructive manipulation rather than sophisticated strategy. The most sustainable approach involves maintaining multiple sources of fulfillment so that their fantasy requirements don't become your entire identity. When your life includes meaningful work, satisfying friendships, engaging hobbies, and personal growth pursuits, accommodating their fantasy becomes one aspect of your life rather than your primary occupation. This diversification protects your psychological well-being while maintaining the authentic independence that makes you attractive to them. Most importantly, successful fantasy maintenance includes exit strategies that protect your dignity and future happiness. Before fully investing in this approach, establish clear standards for treatment, reciprocity, and relationship progression that must be met regardless of how perfectly you embody their fantasy. When you maintain the ability to walk away with your self-respect intact, you paradoxically become more valuable to someone who respects strength and independence above all other qualities. The ultimate goal is creating a dynamic where embodying their fantasy feels natural rather than effortful, where your authentic self aligns closely enough with their ideal that minimal performance is required. When this alignment occurs naturally, you can maintain their fantasy indefinitely while continuing to grow, evolve, and find satisfaction both within and beyond the relationship boundaries.